All right, definers, have you ever wondered how a t-shirt made on the opposite side of the world can only cost $10? Or maybe how fresh fruits and veggies seem to always be available no matter the season? Well, if you're in the mood for your next binge, stop what you're doing and check out this documentary that Cecilia and I have been loving. It's called The Chain: How the World Works. It's a documentary available on Amazon Prime, created by the Association for Supply Chain Management, a group that's basically as obsessed with the supply chain space as we are with sustainability. If there's one thing you know about us, it's that lately we have been going on so many deep dives into the supply chain with our Hot Commodities series, and you've probably heard us talk about matcha, chocolate, sugar, bananas. And if there's one thing that we know about you, definers, it's that you love digging into a topic, learning how it works from the inside out and picking it apart. And this is what The Chain is all about. It dives into 6 different industries, from food to fashion to medicine and sports. And it uses this how it's made storytelling approach to break down complicated topics, including real-world examples and interviews with experts. Sounds familiar? Well, that's because it's basically what we do on the podcast. Aside from being sucked into the stories and the format of these episodes, I have just loved how much sustainability has come up in so many of them. Supply chain and sustainability are industry besties. So as you learn about how some of the most common everyday products move around the world, you'll also get to learn about how some of the ethical and environmental concerns related to how these products are made. Honestly, watching the episodes sheds a whole new light on some of the topics we love to talk about on the podcast so often. So run, don't walk, and go check out The Chain on Amazon Prime.
Hello, Definers, and welcome to episode 98 of Sustainability Defined. Today, we are jumping back into the Hot Commodities series that you all know and love to talk about something especially sweet today: sugar. I'm your host, Cecilia.
And I'm your host, Nethra, and this is the 98th episode of Sustainability Defined,
Woohoo!
And we have something very special planned for our 100th episode. So stay tuned, follow us on social media at Sustainability Defined, on Instagram and LinkedIn, or subscribe to our newsletter at our website, sustainabilitydefined.com. Now, without further ado, let's get into uncovering this global food system.
So far on the Hot Commodities series, we've done chocolate, matcha, bananas, and now we are getting sweet. We are getting tempting. We are getting sugar. So excited to cover this commodity. Cue Sugar by Maroon 5.
Nah, I'm queuing watermelon sugar. Forever a direction here.
I'm queuing Sugar, We're Going Down.
No, but like Alexa, play Sugar Sugar by Frankie J.
No. I'm bringing it up here. Sweetener by Ariana.
Damn.
This is getting too good, Nethra. This could be just an episode in and of itself. But Nethra and I have been researching this interesting commodity for you, and we came here to confidently say that the world does run on sugar.
That's right. Sugar is everywhere, in your morning coffee, your favorite snacks, pastries, desserts, supplements, body care products, you name it.
Literally everywhere.
It's genuinely hard to avoid, and let's be honest, it's pretty addictive, to the point where sometimes we try not to think about how much we're actually consuming.
Like, I'm reading all the labels, trying to see how much sugar everything has. It's sometimes overwhelming. And as you listen to this episode, Definers, I want you to think about everything you've eaten today. Most of the items probably had sugar. It's in our drinks, our sauces, foods we don't even think are sweet have sugar. But behind this everyday ingredient is a global industry shaped by trade, labor, and environmental challenges. And honestly, shaped by a lot of history too, that is pretty dark with most of the global commodities that we get into. But before we do all of that, Nethra, I need to know what your favorite sweet treat is.
A very important question, Cecilia, and I feel like my answer says a lot about me, but I love the molten lava cake from Chili's. I grew up on this. Ate it every year for my birthday. It's like
it's so
having
good.
a bad day, molten lava cake. It's probably 1,000 calories and like at least 100
But who
grams
cares?
of sugar.
Who's counting?
Exactly.
Who's
It doesn't
counting?
count when
Come
you're
on.
at Chili's. What about you, Cecilia?
I think mine's kind of similar. I love a homemade Ghirardelli brownie with ice cream and hot fudge. You can't forget the hot fudge. And maybe some of the maraschino cherries.
Ooh.
That's what does it for me.
I went to the Ghirardelli store in San Francisco and ate one of those sundaes like by
Oh my
myself
gosh.
and then passed out for like 4 hours.
No, yeah, you get so lethargic after like an insane sugar consumption.
Right?
But that store is really cute. Definers, you should go.
No, seriously. Quick agenda for you. To help you follow along with this episode, Definers, we'll get started by breaking down what sugar actually is as a commodity, where it's grown, and how it's produced. Then we'll walk through the entire supply chain, from production all the way to consumption. We'll also take a step back and look at how sugar shaped the modern world, because you really can't talk about this commodity without talking about its past. Along the way, we'll highlight some complex social and environmental challenges tied to sugar because, as we know, no commodity is without its issues, especially in a global high-demand market. And of course, I'm super excited for this. Stay tuned for the interview portion of this episode as we sit down with Fair Trade America to talk about how they're changing labor and sustainability practices in the sugar supply chain.
All right, so first question, how is sugar a hot commodity? Well, a hot commodity is something we define as highly desirable, high demand resource, and sugar definitely fits that definition. Like we said earlier, it's literally everywhere, and it's driven by global consumption and consumer preferences. And when we talk about sugar as a commodity, it's important to note that it's sold in two main forms in the US. It's sold in a white sugar, which is a refined sugar, or it's sold as raw sugar. And zooming out even further, sugar is part of a massive global system. Every year, the world produces around 180 million tons, mostly from sugarcane and sugar beets.
And I just want to take a quick pause here because when people think about raw sugar, a lot of people are thinking about that like sugar in the raw packets.
That's what I was thinking about.
That is actually a refined form of sugar because it's still like powdered and crystallized. When we think about raw sugar, I actually think about jaggery. I grew up eating it. It's sugar that comes in this like block and you have to grate it. In other countries, in Latin American cultures, it might be known as like piloncillo. You can get that in different desserts or drinks. But sugar comes in so many forms. Like I think about my summers in India just drinking sugarcane juice and like having jaggery and different sweets. And it's so good. And that raw sugar is actually really mineral rich. Even in Japan, they have like forms of it called like Okinawa black sugar. But it's really mineral rich. And as it gets refined and refined, those minerals get stripped. And another fun fact, cane sugar, white sugar, is actually not vegetarian or vegan because it has bone dust in it to help get the color, the white color. Yeah, I know. So I always get...
Bone dust?
Yes. It's...
Gotta say, I'm flabbergasted by this, Nethra.
I know. I had to learn that when I was working on being more plant-based. But alternatives are just like cane sugar, 100% cane sugar, of course, brown sugar.
Gotcha.
Raw sugar. But anyways.
Interesting.
Little aside.
We love a side note here.
Here's what most people don't realize, though. Only a fraction of the sugar that you mentioned, that 180 million tons, is actually traded internationally. So most of the sugar that's produced is actually consumed in the country where it's produced, and only about a third enters the global market, which means the global sugar trade is essentially leftovers after a country meets their own needs. So when something disrupts supply, like extreme weather, climate change, shifts in demand, it puts a lot of pressure on that smaller traded portion that's left over.
This is something new that we've seen throughout our Hot Commodity series, Definers, if you've been keeping up with the series. And it goes to show how different these agricultural traded products can be. So it's important to dive into all these different commodities. We learned so many different things through them. But anyways, what Nethra explained is that the reason why this commodity can be so volatile is because the small changes in demand or supply can have an outsized impact on the global market.
And price isn't just about what's happening right now. It's also what people think will happen, right? If analysts expect a surplus of sugar, prices tend to naturally fall. And if they expect a shortage, prices rise. So the market is driven by both reality and prediction.
A tough market, it sounds like. And at the same time, global demand for sugar keeps growing about 1 to 2% every year globally. In the US, the sugar market is projected to reach 102 billion US dollars by 2030, which is about a 6.5% increase from 2024 to 2030. This increase is largely due to population growth, as sugar is a key ingredient in a lot of foods and beverages that we consume. The increase can also be from rising incomes, especially in developing countries where people tend to consume more sugar as their purchasing power increases. They tend to buy more processed foods as purchasing power increases, but the sugar market is much more unpredictable and heavily dependent on things like weather and crop conditions than it is on growing population. So you end up with these cycles or periods where demand literally outpaces the supply, which then pushes the prices up.
Right. And sugar markets have changed like so vastly over centuries. Like at one point, sugar was so valuable that it was literally the name for
Yeah, it was
currency.
like a currency. Yeah.
Right. And now, I mean, sugar is so saturated. Like you said, like you can get like a great value, like 5-pound bag of sugar for like $3.
And it's literally everywhere. Like it's everywhere. It's crazy.
Everywhere.
If you've ever tried to go on a sugar-free diet, definers, please let us know because I want to know what that was like.
I did this in college one time where I cut out all refined sugar except for fruits for like 2 weeks. Not gonna lie, I felt amazing, but like it was definitely having like withdrawals, like an addict.
Of course. That makes sense.
We could go on a totally separate tangent about
Right. Let's get back to
sugar,
it.
its marketing, its addictiveness. That's all not by chance. And neither was the
It's a
spread
separate
of
topic
sugar.
right there.
Right. The spread of sugar was not by chance at all. And we're going to get a little bit more into that history. But going back to what we were talking about, producers respond by growing more sugar, right? When we were talking about the supply, but that takes time. Sugarcane, for example, can take years to fully mature. So by the time supply increases, the market can flip into a surplus, causing prices to drop again. And because of that lag, the sugar market is constantly playing catch up, which adds another layer of volatility.
And what's interesting is that despite how massive and global this industry is, it's historically been pretty slow to change. Innovation has mostly been focused on making production more efficient, so things like higher yields, better refining processes.
But that's starting to shift as consumers become more health conscious, like Cecilia and I are trying to be.
Oh my God, health queens.
And more aware of how much sugar they're consuming. There's increasing pressure on the industry to adapt. So they're seeing more innovation driven by changing preferences, whether that's reducing sugar content like we talked about, exploring alternatives. Maybe you have seen people transitioning to maple syrup, agave, stevia, coconut sugar, right? Or rethinking how sugar is produced and marketed altogether.
Personally, I love agave for my matcha and Nethra. What's your choice?
Ooh, love maple syrup. And it's crazy because while I was at Expo West, for those of you who don't know, it's like one of the country's largest natural foods expos. Like I'm talking like at the Anaheim Convention Center, over 2,000 brands present. I was seeing such an increase in these sugar alternatives. And I'm not talking about like stevia. I'm talking about natural sugar. So like,
See, innovation is there.
right? Coconut sugar, maple syrup. So the trends are really following in that direction.
Exactly. And for example, there has been innovation in sugar reduction technologies aimed at reducing the sugar content in food and beverage products while still maintaining that same taste and texture. This includes techniques such as microencapsulation, which allows for the controlled release of sweetness and flavor modulation, enhancing the perception of sweetness without actually increasing sugar content. So this is a way that, this market is innovating in this space.
Science. There's also another component of the sugar market affecting its demand that we must take into account. So biofuels, right? The utilization of sugar crops such as sugarcane and sugar beets for biofuel production further just increases that demand for sugar. In regions where biofuel mandates or incentives exist, there's actually increased cultivation of sugar crops for this specific purpose. Again, not even for human consumption, but for creating that additional demand pressure and meeting that additional demand pressure on the global market. Brazil is actually the best example of this in the world. They've built an entire national energy program around sugarcane ethanol. And at this point, we're nearly 40% of their sugarcane crop goes towards fuel rather than food. It's one of the most ambitious biofuel programs ever attempted, and it's genuinely fascinating from a sustainability lens because it shows how the same crop can serve completely different global needs simultaneously.
That is fascinating.
Not to
Nethra.
say that this is completely sustainable, because we know that monocropping and deforestation are real.
Right.
But just an interesting case study.
Yeah, and it puts it into perspective. So when you zoom out, sugar isn't just this pantry staple that you have, year round. It's a tightly connected global commodity that is shaped by geography, trade, economic trends, and increasingly environmental and social pressure. And speaking of trade, we have to talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough airtime as it should, which is just how politically protected sugar is, especially here in America. In US American sugar policy is built around, wait, no, hold on.
Especially here in the US.
Especially here in the US. And now I'm starting here, Keaton. American sugar policy is built around price that supports and import quotas, which basically means that the US government artificially keeps domestic sugar prices higher than what you pay on the world market. Yeah, that's right. We're paying higher prices, guys.
What's new?
For consumers, right. Please, don't get me started on the eggs. For consumers, that means paying more for sugar. For farmers in developing countries who could otherwise compete, it means being locked out of one of the biggest markets in the world. So there's a real trade justice dimension here that connects directly to why fair trade certifications matter so much in this space. And we will get into all of that with our guests. So hang tight.
So now that we've covered the economics and volatility of the sugar market, let's get into its production and associated challenges. And honestly, wait, before we even go further into how sugar is produced today,
yeah, hold up.
We'd be doing you a disservice if we didn't take a moment to talk about how sugar actually got to this scale in the first place, which is something that I touched on a little bit earlier in the episode. The history of sugar is not a comfortable one. It's still important to talk about it and address it. When European colonizers brought sugarcane to the Caribbean and the Americas in the 1500s and 1600s, they quickly realized it was extraordinarily profitable and addictive, but that's another story. And they thought to themselves, wow, if only I had an enormous cheap labor force to cultivate and harvest it.
And nothing good comes out of that question, as we know. Yet another globally spread commodity relying on the use of cheap and unpaid labor to climb the economic ladder. We've seen this with our other hot commodities. Same case here. The demand for labor became one of the primary economic justifications for the transatlantic slave trade. Sugar plantations in places like Haiti, Barbados, Jamaica, and Brazil were among the most brutal in the colonial world. Millions of enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to work these fields, and the wealth generated from this sugar flowed back to Europe and built financial empires. So when we talk today about labor exploitation in sugar supply chains, or about the inequality between producing countries and consuming ones, that's not a new story. It has deep roots that go back centuries, and that context matters today.
Right. And again, like Cecilia said, if you've been listening to this series, you know that this is not exclusive to sugar, but sugar was the major driver of the transatlantic slave trade, which which did start slavery in the United States. So it's a very dark commodity to talk about in this regard specifically. And I actually have a personal connection to this history that I think brings it really close to home. One is just being South Indian and growing up around sugarcane plantations. I could talk about this particular part for days, but more closely related in the story that I want to share with you guys today is actually my trip to Sapelo Island, which was where sugarcane first successfully arrived and was established as a commercial crop in the United States. And I never knew this, being from Georgia.
This is new to me, too.
Right?
I'm excited.
So,
let's hear it, Nethra.
Sapelo Island is actually a barrier island off Georgia's coast. Most people don't even know that Georgia has islands.
Wait, I didn't even know it had an island either. I'm learning so much already. Wow.
Okay, quick aside, if you've watched the last song by with Miley Cyrus and Liam
Stop.
Hemsworth.
Cue the tears. I'm not ready. I still haven't recovered. I saw it when I was 13. I haven't recovered.
Right? It was filmed on Tybee Island, which is one of Georgia's barrier islands. And Sapelo Island is not too far from there.
It looks pretty.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. But Sapelo Island has a very interesting history. It's, again, a barrier island off Georgia's coast. Most people don't understand how important it is in U.S. history, especially in the context of sugar spreading across the United States and in the context of slavery's dark and widespread history in our country. So Thomas Spalding first brought the purple ribbon cane, which is a cold, hardy sugarcane species imported from the Caribbean. And he brought it here because it was better suited to the Georgia climate than previous attempts and in previous species. So this basically kick-started modern sugar production as we know it. Sapelo at the time served as the epicenter for early commercial sugarcane production because its climate really supported the growth of it. For those of you who are like, why did you end up on this island? Well, I went to the University of Georgia, Atlanta born and raised, and I studied geography. So I took a class where we focused heavily on studying Sapelo Island, weirdly enough, and the sugarcane trade into North America. And a lot of people don't realize that like sugar basically boosted the economy of North America, obviously riding on the backs of slaves. So let's not get that twisted, but it basically was like a lot of the reason that we got wealth as a country.
That and tobacco.
Yeah, and tobacco, cotton, a lot of these crops that we've studied throughout the years. But we got to go to this island to visit, and it genuinely changed the way I understood the legacy of this industry. So again, for context, Sapelo Island was the home to one of the largest rice and sugar plantations in the antebellum South. And today it has one of the last remaining communities of Gullah Geechee people. And these people are direct descendants of enslaved Africans who worked those fields and made this crop what it is today. Against their will, again, to be very clear. But what makes Sapelo so significant is that these communities actually never fully left. So after emancipation, many freed people stayed on the sea islands because it was the only land they knew. And over generations, they built and preserved a culture and a language and a way of life that is directly traceable back to West and Central Africa. So walking through that island, you still feel the weight of the history. It has a really small population, and it really holds that culture in a tangible way. And the people who still live there, the stories they carry, the land itself, it's all extremely culturally rich.
Wow, what a powerful way to experience this history and, the context of this industry firsthand. What a great field trip they took you on, Nethra.
Yeah, life-changing, really.
What's important for the definers to understand from this is that Sapelo isn't an isolated story. It's a window into what played out across the entire sugar and plantation belt of the Americas. The Gullah Geechee corridor stretches across coastal South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and it exists specifically because of the labor demands of these crops: sugar, rice, and cotton. These people brought to cultivate them weren't just workers. They were stripped of their names, their languages, their culture, their family, their identity, and forced to work. And yet they learned to preserve so much, and that survival and cultural continuity is truly remarkable. I'm jealous you got to see that.
Yeah, and the reason we bring this up in a sustainability podcast is because the thread from that history to today's supply chain is not as broken as we might like to think. In some parts of the world, the conditions in sugarcane fields aren't far removed from what we call forced labor or modern-day slavery. In Brazil, the government labor inspectors have repeatedly found workers in conditions of what they legally classify as degrading labor. Essentially debt bondage, right? Like on sugarcane farms, workers are sometimes recruited specifically from poor regions with promises of good wages and ways to support their families, only to arrive and find they owe money for their transportation, their housing, their food, which they were never told about, and all deducted from the paycheck that never quite covers it. So they're literally stuck in a cycle of slavery and paying back things that they didn't even know that they had to owe. And it's a cycle that's extraordinarily difficult to escape. If you've been following along on the Hot Commodity series, you know this is not unique to sugar.
The Dominican Republic is yet another place where this shows up. For decades, Haitian migrant workers have been brought across the border to cut cane on Dominican betes, which are essentially labor camps on the edges of sugar plantations. Many of these workers have lived and worked there for years, some for generations even, but have been denied citizenship, documentation, or even basic human rights. There have been extensive human rights investigations into this system, and it remains one of the most documented cases of labor exploitation in the modern sugar industry. So when we talk about the Caribbean and sugar, we're not just talking about history, we're also talking about something that is still going on. It has never fully ended.
This is exactly why historical context isn't just a detour in this episode. It's basically the backbone of understanding why sustainability challenges in sugar are so stubborn and so deep. A wicked problem, as we like to say. The infrastructure of exploitation that was built around this crop over centuries created economic and political systems that still benefit some countries and still, of course, disadvantage others. You may remember us mentioning banana republics in our last Hot Commodities episode.
I hope you do.
Which is basically the perfect way to describe this, right? The wealth that was extracted from those Caribbean and Brazilian plantations funded industrialization in Europe and North America. So when we say places are third world countries and we're a first world country, it's because they had to pay the price. Let's not forget that.
Are we?
Right, are we? The countries where that wealth was generated are still, in many cases, amongst the poorest in the world. And that's not a coincidence. It's cause and effect playing out across a very long timeline.
Right, it's systematic. And one more piece of this history worth naming: abolition didn't come easily, and it didn't come because the industry decided to do the right thing.
I love it when they teach us that in school.
Right.
This was never about the right thing.
Exactly, because what do you mean? In Britain, the abolitionist movement fought for decades against one of the most powerful economic lobbies of its time, the sugar planters and merchants, who had enormous influence in Parliament, because these guys were rich. When slavery was finally abolished in the British Empire in 1833, the British government paid reparations, not to the enslaved people, but to the slaveholders, compensating them for their loss of their human property. Yeah, let that sink in, okay? The debt wasn't fully paid off by the British government until 2015. How much? Imagine paying them for their lost human property in 2014. That's
human property, aka slaves. Let's just call it what it is.
Right. That's not a thing. Okay, that shouldn't be a thing. But in a very literal sense, the British taxpayers were still paying for slavery within the last decade. That fact alone tells you how deeply this commodity shaped the financial architecture of the modern world.
This is very disturbing to understand, Definers, so we thank you for following along. We never want to shy away from talking about the reality of these commodities and these situations. So we appreciate you staying with us. Let's now pivot into talking about... Cecilia loves to sing.
From Friends? No, that's from Friends.
Oh my God, you're right.
Yeah.
The couch
Ross
episode.
Geller's yup, mm-hmm.
I thought
it's not because I love to sing. It's because I'm stimming, actually.
Okay, well, let's now pivot.
Keaton, delete that, Keaton.
Let's now pivot into talking about the production and extraction of sugar. Currently, according to the International Sugar Organization, about 108 countries produce sugarcane and sugar beet. Those are the two most prominent crops to produce sugar. Sugarcane is a tall perennial grass that's pretty much widely cultivated for its high sugar content. This plant plays a pivotal role in the global sugar industry as the primary source of sucrose, aka sugar. Within its origins in Southeast Asia, sugarcane has been cultivated for thousands of years and has spread into various tropical and subtropical regions around the world. The sugar content in sugarcane is concentrated in its stalks, which are harvested for processing. The extraction process involves crushing the cane and extracting the juice, which is so good if you've ever had it. I used to literally drink it all the time as a kid with a squeeze of lime.
Yummy.
But after it's crushed into that juice, it is then subjected to various refining and crystallization steps to produce sugar. in its different forms.
And sugarcane is also a very highly versatile crop. Beyond producing sugar, it's used to make products like molasses, ethanol, and bioenergy. The fibrous residue left after the juice is extracted is called bagasse and is often burned to generate electricity and heat for sugar mills, or used as a new raw material in industries like paper and packaging. So, kind of sustainable. This is one of the key ways sugarcane contributes to bioenergy production. Then there's sugar beet, the second sugar that Nethra mentioned. Sugar beet is grown for its sugar-rich taproot and thrives in cooler, temperate regions, making it a perfect complement to sugarcane. The roots are harvested, sliced, and processed to extract sucrose, which is then refined for use in food and other industrial applications.
I actually never knew about sugar beet until we started researching for this podcast. I thought
Me
sugar was
too.
exclusively from sugarcane,
I also thought the same thing, and we'll get more into that, definers. You just wait.
which leads to the question, why do we grow two types of sugar? Which is a good question.
It is a good question.
Sugar beets provide a locally viable alternative in regions where sugarcane can't grow, reducing reliance on imports. And on top of that, the byproducts from sugar beet processing, like pulp, which can be used in animal feed or for bioenergy, adds an extra sustainability benefit to the crop. Who doesn't love a sustainability bonus?
Who doesn't?
It's important to remember, however, that the sugar we know and love is mostly from sugarcane, which tends to be more sensitive to climatic pressures, as it is grown in tropical climates. So about 70% of the world's sugar is from sugarcane, while the remaining 30% is from sugar beet.
And that's probably why we don't know about sugar beet, because 70% is coming from sugarcane, which is all we hear about.
Right, but when you think about it, it's important to have two sources of something, especially when the world is as reliant on sugar as it is, especially with climate change and all these things. Like, you cannot have everything riding on one crop, like the world's economy riding on one crop, right?
Right. Like bananas, how we talked about that in our last episode. Anyway, staying on the topic of production, there are a handful of countries that produce the majority of the global supply. These countries are Brazil, India, Europe, China, Thailand, the United States, Russia, Pakistan, Mexico,
Woo!
and Australia. I had to sing out Mexico, you know?
I should have sang out India.
India!
India!
All right, I'm moving on from singing. This is too much. Okay. The largest country producing sugar is Brazil, which accounts for 23% of global production, and India is the runner-up with 19% of global production.
Yup.
In the United States, sugarcane is produced primarily in Florida, Texas, and Louisiana. Sugar beet dominates regions in the U.S. like the Great Lakes, the Upper Midwest, the Great Plains, and the Far West, think Oregon and California.
Wow, this is like shocking to me to understand that like there is sugar being grown near the Great Lakes.
I know. Literally, sugar is everywhere. I mean, we've been saying this the whole episode.
And we've covered and talked about the different regions, which have clearly come as a shock to us. But let's talk about the stages that come after growing, right? Cultivation, harvesting, refining, processing. Let's focus on breaking down sugarcane since it accounts for 70% of the world's sugar production. So sugarcane is harvested from fields like Florida in the US here and sent to nearby sugar mills. At the sugar mill, the sugarcane stalks are washed and cut into shreds. Huge rollers then press all the juice out of these shredded stalks, and the juice is then clarified, concentrated, and crystallized. The sugars are then spun by a centrifuge to remove all the liquid and produce that sweet, golden, raw cane sugar.
Yummy.
And one thing worth flagging here in the harvesting stage is that in many parts of the world, before sugarcane is harvested, the fields are actually set on fire. This pre-harvest burning is done to clear the leaves and make the stalks easier to cut, but it releases like enormous amounts of smoke and particulate matter into the air. So communities living near these fields, often the same low-income communities where the workers and their families live, breathe that in. And it's a public health issue, you guys. It's a huge public health issue that doesn't get nearly enough attention. And it's one of the reasons some sustainability standards are now pushing for green harvesting, which means harvesting without burning. And if two things, if any of you have ever been in a sugarcane field, I think I mentioned to you that I've grown up around them in India. they're very dense bush because the sugarcane stalk doesn't just grow straight up. It has tons of leaves, sort of like corn. And I think they do this again to make it easier to just extract it really fast. Secondly, I don't know if you guys have had sugarcane juice before, but when you press the juice out of a sugarcane, you maybe get like 1.5 to 2 cups of juice per like a big stalk. And then you just are left with all of this waste. So there is so much waste produced from this process. And I actually remember meeting in college, someone came and spoke to us from a company called Tree Zero. I would love to know if they're still around, but they make paper from all the sugarcane pulp and waste.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, someone's end material or waste is someone's new raw material.
Exactly. Someone come up with something. We need to fix that.
Yeah, multi-million-dollar idea right there. And a quick fun note to add here, the amount of molasses left on the crystals or added back to the sugar crystals determines which type of sugar is being produced. Beyond the traditional white granulated sugar that you use in like baking and light brown and dark sugars, there are lightly colored sugars, which are like golden or tan and produced for specialty uses.
I know, Cecilia, it's cool because a lot of people think that brown sugar is like a natural, more raw sugar, but it's actually not. It's just white sugar with added molasses.
Right. That's what I thought going into it because it's like, like whiter wheat bread. I kind of thought the same deal here. I don't know why I was making assumptions though.
Right. Yeah. Hate to break it to you definers, brown sugar is not healthier. But
dang it.
Back to production. It doesn't end at that sweet golden cane sugar. After it's been spun and all that, raw sugar is then transported to a cane sugar refinery where it gets purified. Here, the raw sugar is melted and filtered to remove impurities, and the sugar is then crystallized and dried out, and then it's ready to be packaged and shipped out to grocery stores and food manufacturers.
Lots of traveling between these steps is what I'm picking up, Nethra.
A lot.
And here's where things get even more eye-opening. Because of all these steps we just described, they're not exactly low impact. From the moment sugarcane is harvested through milling, refining, and just literally transporting the product, sugarcane production is very carbon intensive. First, processing sugarcane into raw and refined sugar takes a lot of energy. These mills often burn the bagasse, the fibrous leftover from the cane, to generate the electricity, which helps offset some of the carbon emissions. But a lot of these mills, still rely on coal or natural gas, especially in countries where bagasse alone can't meet the whole energy demand of the sugar mill. Then there's also the transportation aspect to the carbon emission of the supply chain. Sugar moves huge distances from fields to mills, from the mill to the refinery, and then from the refinery to the market to the consumer all around the world. I mean, every truck, cargo ship, or train, or even plane adds to the overall carbon footprint of that sugar before it even reaches your grocery store. And then you have to get in the car and take it home.
And we have the audacity as human beings to waste 1/3 of food that is produced.
No, literally. Like,
after all this.
I'm so overwhelmed. But on top of the carbon emission, land use for sugar cultivation can contribute to even more carbon emissions. Converting forests or wetlands into sugar fields releases stored carbon into the atmosphere, especially if these fields are being burned, like Nethra mentioned. And intensive fertilizer use adds nitrous oxides and other potent greenhouse gases to this land, which are getting released. So while sugar may seem like a simple sweetener to us for our morning coffee delight, the journey from field to table actually comes with a surprisingly heavy environmental and social cost.
Not so sweet, huh? Not so sweet.
But
And that's just the carbon cost of sugar production. The environmental cost does not end there. Let's talk about water, right? Sugar production is thirsty. Sugarcane in particular requires huge amounts of water to grow, especially in tropical regions where most of it is cultivated. That means fields are often heavily irrigated, putting a strain on local water supplies. It doesn't stop there. Fertilizers, pesticides, these are all used to boost sugar yields and can run off into nearby rivers, lakes, and wetlands. This runoff adds excess nutrients to the water. And when we say nutrients, we're not talking about like biotin and vitamins. We're talking about offsetting the natural composition of the water, which can trigger harmful algae blooms and hurt aquatic ecosystems. So while sugar can be sweet in your coffee, the water footprint behind it is surprisingly bitter.
Oh, great pun, Nethra. Great job.
So cheesy.
It's interesting because, when you think about it, every natural system has a balance. And when you're adding things like fertilizer, you're dumping excess nutrients and it upsets that balance. So the system is upset and things literally die. And that's what happens. That's why everything is a wicked problem. Anyway, here's a quick metric so you can envision how much water this actually is. But
I'm scared.
let's see if we can even envision this, because sometimes when people dump a lot of numbers on you, you're like, what does that mean though? But here we're talking about 500 to 1,000 liters, which is like 200 gallons on average to produce just 1 pound of sugar cane.
Sugar cane, not sugar, by the way.
Yeah. And I mean, Nathan mentioned how much juice you actually get out of the sugar cane. So it can't be that much, right? Sugar beet, on the other hand, is grown in temperate regions with cooler climates and generally require less water. So while both crops have environmental impacts, sugarcane's water footprint tends to be much higher, which is an important consideration for sustainability.
Another large environmental cost for this commodity is land use change. And what I mean by land use change is a transformation of natural or managed land by humans from one purpose to another, such as turning forests into agricultural use. In countries like Brazil, which I did mention is one of the highest producers of sugarcane, expanding sugarcane fields has contributed to deforestation. And we know what incredible, powerful, beautiful forest exists in Brazil, the Amazon.
The Amazon. And when forests or other natural lands are cleared, often through burning, like Nathan mentioned, it releases stored carbon that the land has been holding. It reduces biodiversity and can disrupt local communities. Yes, it can impact humans too. Sugar beet is usually grown in temperate regions, so it carries less deforestation risk than sugarcane does. However, large-scale cultivation still impacts the soil and the habitat. So we've covered up to this point the environmental side of sugar in terms of carbon, water, and land use. But the story does not end there. Behind every sugarcane field and sugar beet farm and the people who do the work, their experiences reveal a whole nother set of challenges.
Exactly. Sugar production, like I said, is incredibly labor intensive. Like many of the other commodities we've talked about on the podcast, workers often spend long hours in harsh conditions, and in some regions, issues like low wages, unsafe working environments, and even child labor are still a reality. And definers, we want to pause on the human cost here for a second because there's a story that doesn't get nearly enough mainstream attention. In Central America, particularly Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, there has been a documented epidemic of chronic kidney disease amongst sugarcane workers, and researchers believe that the leading cause is the conditions of the work itself. These workers are cutting cane in extreme heat, often without adequate water, rest breaks, and shade for like literal hours, and the repeated dehydration and heat appears to be destroying their kidneys over time. And this can be called CKDU, chronic kidney disease of unknown origin. It's killed tens of thousands of workers over the past few decades, and these are people in their 30s and 40s. That's half the natural human lifespan.
So sad.
It's one of the most serious and unreported occupational health crises in the global agriculture and is directly tied to the sugar on our shelves.
This is why certifications like fair trade exist. They help ensure that the sugar we consume isn't produced at the expense of workers' rights or well-being. So, next time you're at the grocery store, you're looking to buy sugar, here's where we say, vote with your dollar.
Vote with it.
Vote with your dollar.
We
and
need
look
a
for
jingle.
that fair trade certification, okay? We do need a jingle, but that can be our own jingle. We can make our own jingle.
I'm down.
It's also worth mentioning that there is a global sustainability standard specifically built for sugarcane called Bonsucro. It covers environmental criteria like water use and land conversion, but it also covers labor standards. It's not perfect, but it represents the industry starting to take accountability seriously. Look for the Bon Sucro label or fair trade certifications next time you're buying sugar. It's one of the most direct ways consumers can push this supply chain into a better direction.
Yes, I was at the bodega yesterday and I actually saw a fair trade sugar brand. I think the name was Wholesome. They have like a bunch of different products.
Ooh.
So not sponsored, but just check them out, Definers, and look into some more brands that are carrying this, because we are going to dive deeper and tell you why it's so important and how fair trade works, the impact it has on sugar farmers around the world, and so much more. We are thrilled to have Amanda Arquilla, the Executive Director of Fair Trade America, joining us today. She's going to break down how fair trade supports ethical labor practices, promotes sustainability, and helps communities thrive, and is changing the sugar industry as we know it. So stay tuned for our interview portion up next.
All right, Definers, to help us unpack what's really happening behind the scenes with sugar, we are joined by Amanda Arquilla, the Executive Director of Fair Trade America, who works closely with sugar supply chains and farming communities around the world. Fair trade has spent decades working to make global trade more equitable, and sugar is a powerful example of why that work matters. We are so excited to talk with Amanda today about why sugar has stayed out of the spotlight and what would it take to build a fairer, more resilient sugar industry. Amanda, welcome to the podcast. We are so glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about your background, how you got into working in this space, maybe what inspires you?
Do you have a sweet tooth? Are you a sugar addict? Tell us everything.
All very valid questions for this conversation. So I really started my passion for fair trade as a college student. I was actually a college student activist up at NYU, shout out Fighting Violets, as they used to be called, really advocating for fair trade policy and fair trade procurement on our college campus. This was a time when fair trade activism and movement building was really strong in the United States and was really part of this broader conversation around trade justice. And we were petitioning our procurement companies at the time to bring fair trade coffee and chocolate and sugar onto campus. And my career has evolved since then. I lived abroad for a couple of years in India, working in cotton supply chains, on fair trade adjacent certification work. And then I spent a good chunk of my earlier career actually working on another sweet tooth related business, which was chocolate. So I worked for a fair trade chocolate company owned by cocoa farmers, Divine Chocolate, for a number of years. And then went to business school, worked at Amazon for a number of years. So sort of in the big belly of the future of the world of retail, for better or worse, at the time. And then had the opportunity to come back to a lot of the passion work that had established my early career with fair trade just a few years ago. So it's been a winding journey, but really understanding consumer goods and how we buy and sell and produce the products that make our everyday lives a little bit sweeter is a real passion for me.
I love the punchline. Makes it sweeter.
Yeah, I mean, sugar is everywhere in so many different forms, from soda to biofuels, yet most consumers never think about where it comes from. Like I said before, it's kind of like an invisible commodity just making its way in everything. And when you compare it to like coffee or cacao, despite its massive social and environmental footprints, a lot of people don't think about where it comes from. So what do you think makes this commodity more mainstream than others?
You're absolutely right around sugar being so important in global supply chains, the food we eat, the livelihoods of so many. You have an estimated more than 100 million people involved in sugarcane production globally. You have small scale farmers in particular, which really fair trade focuses on, producing about 40% of the world's sugarcane. That's 60 million smallholder farmers around the world in countries and regions all around the world. And fair trade, we're a global network of around 2 million farmers and workers that are really focused on creating a new model of trade that's based on partnership rather than exploitation. And we work with small scale sugarcane producers in Asia, Pacific, Latin America, Africa. And we work with about 45,000 farmers across around 87 different producer groups. So it feels at scale, right? It feels really large and impactful and important, but you're absolutely right. Sugar isn't often top of mind when we think about, particularly in the sustainability space, its kind of scale and impact. And I think there are a number of factors at play there, whether that's looking at its deeply, deeply troubled history of production interwoven with the global slave trade and colonialism, its complex relationship with human health and how it is or often isn't embraced by what we would deem as the natural food sector in the US. And that natural food sector tends to be the one leaning into sustainable supply chains first. But sugar isn't always a welcome part of that conversation, or we're looking for, quote unquote, healthier alternatives. And also the reality that sugar doesn't always have as many quality, flavor, taste profile differentiators as in coffee or cocoa, where you have brands and companies that really want to highlight, shine, profile where they're sourcing their coffee or their cocoa from, because that defines quality, taste,
So
flavor. And you don't have that level of differentiation in 99% of the sugar we consume globally. And so I think those all contribute to it being kind of this more hidden part of the discussion in global supply chains.
That's so true. I feel like most people, when they're buying sugar, they're like, what can I get for the cheapest cost?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I want to zoom out for a little bit. I'm curious to learn about how fair trade is bringing fair trade essentially to these small farmers. You mentioned that you guys work with a multitude of small farmers around the globe. So could you walk us a little bit more on maybe some of the day-to-day work at fair trade and working with these farmers?
Fair trade is most well known as this sort of economic, social, and environmental certification. What we do to implement that certification is we work with producers, farmers, all the way up to the brands that make and sell products to ensure that they're meeting a set of standards, getting audited accordingly to ensure that they're actually following the integrity of those standards, and then making sure that consumers are educated and aware of what fair trade means. So that's sort of the broad landscape of what we do. I think more directly in terms of day-to-day work, particularly at the farmer level, 50% of Fair Trade International's global governance is actually made up of producers having a vote in how we set our standards, how we make strategic decisions across the organization. And you have our producer network representatives, which are made up of hundreds of staff people on the ground all around the world that are interfacing with producers every single day. And they're not only giving them access to training and resources on the certification standard itself, but also doing these kind of above and beyond investments to make sure that we're meeting the most urgent needs of producers so that they not only have more sustainable livelihoods, but they have real power in global supply chains, which they have historically been left out of. So that kind of day-to-day work in partnership with producers on the ground, as well as this kind of full broader supply chain certification, auditing, and kind of consumer market awareness and education are all sort of pieces of the puzzle of fair trade.
And I have to ask, when you're in these sites and people are auditing, what happens when you track down misconduct? What happens if something goes wrong? What's the protocol for approaching that? And how do you make sure it doesn't happen again?
When it comes to certification and auditing, particularly with highly sensitive social issues, it oftentimes is really meaningful when you identify something that's not working, because then you can actually identify the root cause and go about and fix it. So there's sort of typical things that happen, right? Depending on the nature of what we call a non-compliance, very kind of jargony terms, but you identify a non-compliance and then you work with that partner to identify an action plan to mitigate it moving forward. So let's say there's an issue with how fertilizers or chemicals are being used or stored at the facility, and that's creating a safety hazard. It's identifying it as a non-compliance and then ensuring through follow-up and partnership with those folks, what are the actions you need to take in place to remediate or fix that non-compliance. So identifying problems rather than, I think sometimes when people think about sustainability certifications, they say, well, when you identify a problem, you should just kick those guys out, right? And it's like, well, actually, that's the
You
worst
got to
thing you
help
could
them.
do.
Yeah, these are
Right.
people's livelihoods.
Exactly. And so it's making sure that there's a path to rectify the problem and that the producers have the resources to do it so that they're actually preventing it for the long run.
We talked a little bit about this with Tony's Chocolonely on our cacao episode of Hot Commodities. Child labor, for example, very delicate subject, and families don't want to make their children do this, but a lot of times they don't have a choice because it's their only form of income and it's complicated. So when dealing with issues like that, I'm sure you guys are also playing this very delicate walk of not just firing someone, because then you're exacerbating their issues and their circumstances. So yeah, how do you deal with something complex like that?
For something as complex as child labor, right, there is no sort of single silver bullet solution that solves such a structural and systemic issue that has been driven by exploitation and vulnerability in supply chains for generations. And so certification is kind of just one tool in the toolbox for that. I think our primary focus when it comes to sensitive issues beyond identifying them in audits and then remediating is really looking at how do you equip producers and then cooperatives more broadly to educate, appropriately resource farmers so that they don't have a situation where they're faced with the unthinkable choice of employing young people and children in production. And so that means, are we ensuring that they have access to schooling, that they're registered to go to school, that they have the fees and uniforms and school books to go to school? And how is the cooperative investing in that? Looking at the root causes. So that's something that's particular to fair trade when it comes to us talking about this thing called the fair trade premium. So all manufacturers in the supply chain, they have to pay producers an additional premium that then the cooperatives vote democratically on how to invest in their community. So it's a cooperative's individual and autonomous decision to say, look, we know that there are major issues with access to education in our particular community and cooperative. So we're going to vote this year to invest the premium in updating the school building, or providing access to materials. But maybe in a different community, the major risks and challenges are totally different, right? It could be access to potable water. And so, it's important for us as a global organization to not dictate how farmers spend their money. And so for us, this is really about shifting the balance of power and the power of decision making into the hands of producers who know what they need best.
That is amazing that fair trade is giving back so much power to a lot of these small farmers that otherwise wouldn't have the power to vote for a change they wanted to make in their community. And as we talk about all these different commodities on the podcast, we always come across, having a discussion on these systemic issues that have filtered throughout the supply chain for generations. And we found that a lot of the core problems involved with a lot of these commodities are whether the commodity is priced very low, there's rising input costs, there's an imbalance in demand, or this power imbalance that you have mentioned as well. What would you say is one of the core problems for this commodity, and how is fair trade mitigating that issue?
So your question is incredibly valid one, and particularly pronounced in the world of sugar. There was actually an ILO, International Labor Organization, study or report back in 2017 that stated that the global sugar market is one of the most distorted agricultural markets in the world because of a lot of these dynamics, in addition to regulation, competition, environmental factors affecting productivity and price volatility. So you have these low prices and rising production costs contributing to this multi-factored poverty among small-scale producers who, again, have really limited negotiating and power. And so from fair trade's perspective, power is often at the heart of issues around poverty and resilience. Poverty isn't some sort of amorphous concept that serves as the root cause of these issues. Poverty in global commodity supply chains is driven by historic structural exploitation from companies who've taken advantage of vulnerable people. And so fair trade's model is designed to really chip away at that power imbalance over time.
Right. And speaking of power imbalances, there tend to be a lot of power imbalances between laborers and large organizations. And I don't know exactly where fair trade fits in as like the supporter of, obviously you were the supporter of laborers, but maybe a middleman in that somewhere as well. Sugarcane harvesting is still some of the most physically dangerous agricultural work in the world. I've seen it myself firsthand being Indian. How do labor conditions, heat stress, wage theft, migration status, all of these things shape the sustainability conversation and how fair trade is taking a role in this? Like, where do you guys find yourself as positioned in this story?
You're absolutely right that, low incomes for farmers and cane cutters, seasonal workers, can prompt a lot of these negative and hazardous conditions, whether that's relying on child labor, exploiting migrant labor, overusing harmful pesticides, dependent on credit, which actually can create debt bondage situations in sugar production globally. You have a lot of these interrelated issues that create extremely difficult, physically challenging conditions where exploitation can come about, particularly with migrant workers that are seasonal. Women in particular face disproportionate barriers when it comes to things like access to land and services. And so better incomes is one key lever to alleviating some of these pressures because it puts farmers and workers in a position where they don't have to rely on some of these hazardous practices. But beyond that, fair trade has invested in, with our producer network partners, a number of programs specifically focused on better labor practices. So we have developed a number of programs across various countries since around 2020 to mitigate some of these risks of human rights violations. For example, in Belize, we have a youth-inclusive community monitoring and remediation system. So what this means is it involves young people in the community to address labor risks proactively. So they get training on how to identify these risks, call them out, and address them and remediate them. It also engages them in future, more sustainable production methods for sugarcane. So addressing labor issues and human rights challenges actually has meaningful environmental benefits as well. We've implemented updated worker agreements to improve safety conditions, particularly with seasonal workers, campaigns on adequate hydration, thermoses. And then in other countries, we've had things like trainings and support on reducing chemical use, safe handling of chemicals, which again can be very hazardous to labor. And I think the last example I would bring up, particularly as it pertains to women in production, is Fair Trade established a childcare program in Costa Rica so that women can focus on working while having safe and protected environments for their children, so that they can, put more power into their own hands for the future. So a lot of different kinds of programs, and you'll see that these programs aren't sort of a broad brush approach to every different country because the issues are local, they're specific to those contexts. So again, it's about fair trade partnering with those producer organizations locally and identifying the greatest needs to address some of these challenges.
You mentioned that a lot of the times when you work to resolve these social systemic issues that you can see environmental benefits. Could you provide some examples of some benefits maybe that you've seen or that fair trade is really proud of?
Climate challenges are pronounced in most tropical commodities. Sugar is no exception to that. But when we provide farmers with the resources, the tools, the education to invest in climate resilient production, everyone gains from that, right? So you have healthier soils from practices in agroecology, from intercropping. There was some recent work done on adding lime to the soil and production because particularly when you're in sort of high volcanic ash areas, so in some of the countries in which we work, improving the pH in the soil really improves productivity and yields and soil health over time. But it really is about ensuring that the farmers have access to that knowledge, that insight, that technical expertise, and those resources. So again, the more you equip farmers with the skills and the resources and the money to do this work, the better off they will be able to manage climate resilience, yield challenges, volatility moving forward.
Yeah, it's all about empowerment, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as we talk about empowerment and moving this imbalance of power into the hands of small farmers, a lot of talk has been happening about how pricing power and long-term contracts can foster sustainability in the long term. Could you explain how fair trade is positioned in this and what changes on the ground and for the farmers when a buyer commits to a long-term contract, or maybe they commit to buying fair trades? What did you call it? The
premiums.
Yes,
for
the
farmers.
premium.
Yeah.
I can only imagine that type of stability for a community could really change everything, knowing that they have a source of income. So I'm so curious to hear your answer on this.
Yes. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, you beat me to the punch a little bit, right? It provides certainty in an environment where there is little to none of that, particularly in highly price volatile commodities, and sugar is absolutely part of that. It really can't be emphasized enough that changes in production patterns, weather, demand cause all of these unforeseeable kind of upturns and downturns in price that farmers have little to no protection against. So when they have long-term contracts and they can expect and plan on things like a premium for a longer period of time, it allows them to make bigger, more strategic investments that can have scalable impact. So for example, right, in sugar, you have really major challenges in water usage, and investing in systems like drip irrigation that often can actually be quite technically robust, requiring software and training. Those are systems that you need scalable investment for to impact the broadest number of communities. And so when you have long-term contracts, and particularly hopefully long-term fair trade contracts, these cooperatives can plan and say, okay, we can actually bundle these investments over a period of time so that we're actually having impact for a broader number of farmers, communities, and their families. I would also call out long-term contracts can make it easier for farmers to access finance. So when you're working in a commodity like sugar, where you basically have one major harvest a year, and so you may only actually get paid 1, 2, 3 times the whole year for your production, access to cash, to liquidity, right, as we would call it, is absolutely essential and really risky for farmers. So needing access to finance over the course of a year is really important. And investors are more willing to lend money to producers that show that they have a stable long-term relationship with their buyers. So there are other kind of ripple effects related to long-term contracts that can have meaningful impact on livelihoods.
I can only imagine. I mean, you're taking a farmer out of survival mode in that case, just not knowing what their next income and link is. So I'm curious, with sugar being harvested once a year, that's pretty risky. That's really volatile for a lot of farmers, especially considering the extreme climate state that we're in right now, with water patterns being hard to track, droughts being more profuse, floods being more profuse, and just changes in rainfall patterns already affecting yields and farmer incomes so intensely. How is fair trade taking initiatives to mitigate these risks and consequences for farmers?
So, I brought up the drip irrigation example earlier, and that's actually not just part of some of the individual investments that producer organizations are making, but broader structural investments that fair trade is doing through our own Sugar Climate Action Program, which involves working with a number of sugarcane producing countries. And we've been doing this work since around 2019 to stabilize supply chains in the face of decreasing yields. And so that involves training and support in things like drip irrigation, in things like providing some of the software backup for that, but also giving farmers the tools to measure their own greenhouse gas emissions, sometimes to use as actually an important negotiating tool, right? Fair trade sugar producers tend to have lower GHG emissions, almost approaching net zero in certain cases. And that's actually really valuable for bargaining, right? For negotiating, to say, hey, for companies that are seeking lower greenhouse gas emissions, they should be buying from fair trade producers like in sugar. But giving producers access to that information information, and that data is critical. And you have a lot of times in the supply chain, no big surprise, supply chain actors who are collecting that data themselves, but not actually putting it into the hands of farmers. So farmers owning their own impact data when it comes to things like climate resilience and measurements is really important from fair trade's perspective and from the perspective of our producers. So there are a number of things like doing that kind of tracking, emissions tools, irrigation work. The application of lime is actually part of that broader project that we were doing. And then also transitioning as much as possible to things like biofertilizers and organic nutrients away from some of these hazardous agrochemicals is really important, not just from a labor and safety perspective, but also from a climate perspective.
That's incredible. So fair trade gives a lot of educational resources and other type of resources, not just financial, to farmers and small producers. And then they get investors to invest in their farm. I'm curious, what are they investing in? Is it like drip irrigation and maybe adopting like these agroforestry practices?
Well, usually when I talk about investors, like I talked about earlier, it's mostly people that are providing access to credit to farmers. So this is access to credit for them to tie over their access to liquidity, to cash, during periods where they have to spend money to invest in their own farms, right, to improve quality, et cetera, but they don't actually have the liquid cash to do it because they don't get paid for another 3 to 6 months. So that's usually kind of the financial institutions that we're talking about. And then businesses, when they're buying and trading in these commodities, that's where they're just paying, right, what these global prices are. And in the fair trade case, right, also paying these additional premiums that the producers then invest.
You've mentioned drip irrigation and the transition away from these chemicals and pesticides used in agriculture. I just wanted to ask you about agroforestry. We talked a lot about this in when I was in college and my master's, about how that was a solution to a lot of the climate sensitive crops around the world. And I wanted to hear your take on agroforestry.
Fair trade are huge champions of agroforestry. I've seen it firsthand, executed really, really beautifully at scale, particularly in things like coffee and cocoa. Agroforestry can be beneficial in those commodities, not just because of the shade it provides, but because of the richness and nutrients that it provides the soil. In sugarcane in particular, I think one of the conversations, because it tends to also be more monocropped, is intercropping other things to increase soil health. So there is that sort of similar concept applied, but agroforestry absolutely as a powerful tool. Also from the perspective of reforestation, right? We've got major systemic deforestation challenges in a lot of the tropical commodities in which fair trade works. So making sure that farmers are able to invest in agroforestry, in intercropping, not just for soil health, but also for increasing their own access to cash crops. So in the off season, when it's not harvest season and you don't have access to capital, you're often intercropping other plants that you can sell in local markets, right? Local fruits and vegetables and produce. And so that kind of diversity is also an income stabilization investment as much as it is a climate investment.
I'm so mad that like every commodity we need needs to grow in like a rainforest environment. Like, why can't we have commodities that can grow in like a mall parking lot that's been abandoned, or like or like on a New York City rooftop? Can we invent
Nethra,
that?
you could invent that, you would be rich.
I mean, as climates change, there are changing all sorts of levels and locations for where these things are going to be grown, which is both risky thing for livelihoods, but also potentially new opportunities. I'd love to dig up a bunch of parking lots and grow coffee and cocoa and sugar.
I am from Atlanta. We have too many parking lots. Like, let's get a sugarcane cooperative.
Yeah.
Not one of those. I'm down.
Do you guys ever work with like carbon credit markets?
Fair trade has considered carbon credits in the past, and we did have some standards development around it where farmers could do that. We didn't see major uptick in the opportunity for carbon credits, largely because the carbon credit market is really volatile and ever-changing.
Yeah.
And it's not something that fair trade is doing right now at scale. But we know that some of our producer organizations are setting themselves up to be involved in carbon credits, because a lot of our producer organizations are doing the real work themselves, particularly on things like agroforestry and reforestation initiatives that can participate in those markets.
And before we wrap up our interview, where can definers listening to the podcast find fair trade sugar if they wanted to buy that?
Most fair trade sugar that you would really find in the US market is inside some of your favorite chocolate bars, like Tony's Chocolonely, Hugh Kitchen,
Yes.
Endangered Species. We've got a lot of really strong chocolate partners. And then, of course, critically, everyone's favorite ice cream company, Ben & Jerry's,
Yes.
uses all fair trade sugar. So you can be even more excited to binge on that pint of Ben & Jerry's this weekend.
Ooh.
What about for people who just want to buy like a bag of sugar?
In the US, it's somewhat limited, so it's sort of hard to find at scale. We don't have any major brand partners that are doing Fair Trade International certified sugar, but we're hoping that's going to be changing actively very soon. So just keep an eye out on the shelf. Always look for the Fair Trade International mark when you're in stores. And you can identify, and if it's a multi-ingredient product, look on the back and you'll see in the ingredients list which ones are fair trade. And you can definitely find options in the store. So we're hoping to really increase kind of that bulk sugar options in the US market really soon.
Perfect.
All right. Fingers crossed.
You'd be thrilled to know that I actually always look for the fair trade logo, especially when I'm buying anything that I know are commodities.
Because you're doing what, Nethra?
I'm voting with my dollars, Cecilia. Amanda, to fill you in, we say this like 10 times on every single podcast, but it's become sort of like a slogan of ours. We tell the definers every time, vote with your dollar. If you're going to be investing in food or products, use this as a chance to invest in an initiative that you really believe in. And I truly believe in the work that Fair Trade's doing. Critics sometimes can argue that voluntary certification can't fix structural trade inequities. And where do you fall on that? Do you agree with that critique? I wouldn't assume so, given your title, but where do you think that sometimes labeling can maybe miss the mark?
I have always said that voluntary certification, particularly when it's robust, it's third party, and it's inclusive of producer voice, can be one critical tool in the toolbox in the fight for trade justice. Like I mentioned earlier, fair trade certification came out of a much broader movement of people and organizations looking to hold industry, governments accountable to extractive policies and practices. And we continue to need that multi-sector movement moving forward. Fair trade alone, voluntary certification alone cannot solve these incredibly complicated multi-sectoral challenges that have also largely been created by organizations that have massive, massive market power. So I firmly believe that these kinds of certifications like fair trade have an important role to play, but we cannot do it alone. No single organization can solve these challenges alone. So we need to be pushing and challenging companies by voting with our dollar, right? That's one of the most important signals you can send to industry, that consumers actually care about these companies investing in sustainable livelihoods for their producers. Government policies that are requiring sustainability and corporate social responsibility and due diligence. So we have an important role to play. I am deeply, deeply passionate about the role that fair trade can play. But we absolutely need a broad coalition of actors to be making the kind of meaningful change that we seek to see in the world.
Definitely. And this comes down to quite literally almost everything.
Yeah. Wicked problems all
Everything
around.
is a group project.
Yeah.
Well, Amanda, it has been great having you on the podcast and getting to learn more about fair trade and how much they really deeply consider and value producers and small farmers, and how they have taken this bottom-up approach and executed it. So it's been great to learn about that. Thank you for sharing all your insight and answering all of our questions. And as we wrap up this interview, we now have one final question that we ask everyone that comes on to this podcast. This is our party fact question. And so it goes something like this. If you were at a party and you wanted to drop a fact that was a sort of shock factor into the crowd about sugar or fair trade, what would your party fact be?
That is a good question.
We put you on the spot.
I think it's really important for people to remember that in something like sugar, you have 100 million people around the world rely on its production for their livelihoods.
Whoa.
So we shouldn't diminish how important it is to think about what we're buying and the real tangible impact it has on the people around us. These aren't small numbers. These aren't lives that are so far away from us that we can't imagine. These are integrated with our own communities and our cultures and our ways of being. So don't forget, 100 million people in sugar and many, many millions more in some of the products that you love. So vote with your dollar, vote with your wallet. Shop responsibly.
Vote with your dollar.
Thank you for
that.
For saying
and we're
that,
ending it on that note.
Thank you for saying that, Amanda.
Thank you both. Yeah. Thank you both for raising awareness on these issues and investing your time in this podcast to talk about these topics, because knowledge really does make all the difference when it comes to making real scalable change in these kinds of products.
For sure.
And with every commodity, it's so important, like you said, to think about the hands that are picking and producing and distributing what we're eating. So I love that note of acknowledgement to end this episode out. Thanks so much, Amanda.
Thank you both.
That's a wrap on sugar definers, one of the world's most familiar ingredients, but also a very complex commodity with a dark past. From the fields where it's been grown to the systems that bring it to our shelves, sugar carries a story of labor, trade, and global impact that often goes unseen. As we've heard today, the choices behind how sugar is produced and how we choose to source it can have real implications for workers, communities, and the environment. Whether it's supporting more transparent supply chains or simply being more curious about where our food comes from, small shifts can add up. So thank you for listening.
Absolutely. And a huge, huge thank you to Fair Trade America for hopping on Sustainability Defined today and giving us an excellent interview into the way that they are changing the sugar industry firsthand and other commodities that we will cover and have covered on this series. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Nethra.
And I'm your host, Cecilia. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow Sustainability Defined on Instagram and LinkedIn. Leave us a review and share this episode with a friend who might see sugar a little differently after this. See you next time.